And so I think you are experiencing a nonprofit, um, um, attempting to also spin out companies and support sort of classic entrepreneurship. Do you find that most VCs see value the way you just described it in the de-risking that the nonprofits can do, or and therefore are open to this kind of collaboration, or do they view them as another aspect of the academic research, which fundamentally is way early compared to where they want to invest?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's openness, on a case by case basis. I think it really just depends on the particular nonprofit and, what different types of ways they can help. The biomedical institutes, obviously are one type of an organization that are interesting. Then there's, a lot earlier things. Like I'm also on the board of Mass Challenge. They do a lot with helping early startups. Nucleate is also quite interesting. So I think you have a lot of different organizations that are able to be helpful and be able to be an important piece of the growth that can happen in this industry. And I think science is a place where there's a lot of importance for the nonprofit sector because it's not so straightforward. Science is very complicated and it takes a long time, and there's a lot of high risk and a lot of capital that needs to be put into it. And from a venture capital standpoint, one of the nice things is, especially with an academic institution, is a lot of these labs sometimes they'll have had quite a bit of de-risking already because you'll have years and years and years of capital that's been poured into a lab to de-risk an asset or a technology. And so that's very important. And that's why, sometimes these things can be a bit more mature when they spin out of the lab versus it just being an idea. And so there is somewhat of a balance between that.
Yep. Yeah. So maybe I want to give you an opportunity to sort of tell us a little bit about your own endeavors at the moment. I know you are building a new fund. It's still, as I gather, mostly under stealth mode. Um, but tell us about RX Capital and what how you position yourself in this landscape and what you are anticipating being able to do.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what I can share, I think we see a big opportunity at the intersection of healthcare and technology. We think there's more and more of a convergence of those two worlds. So we're really excited about the future of what that holds, looking at how data science and AI and software can play into the future of creating new technologies in biotech and speeding up that process and making it more efficient and effective. Um, and then obviously, we come at it, at the earlier stages, thinking about the ecosystem that our family has created, around labs. From the Langer Lab, there's now been 1,000 students, and they're now professors at over 400 universities around the world. And so, we see a lot of really exciting technologies and startups and founders that are, creating great innovation, around that ecosystem. The other thing I've been doing is I made an IMAX film that came out in April called Superhuman Body. And it's the story of the innovation and the science de-risking around cardiovascular disease and the heart valve, cancer treatment through CAR T cell therapy, in the future of prosthetics. And it's playing in about 100 theaters now. And Matthew McConaughey is the narrator. And so that's my little plug on that. But I think it's important because I think people need to be inspired about science. Science isn't always the most exciting thing. If you ask, 10 people when they start learning about science, which is generally, middle school or high school, it's pretty brutal. Those chemistry classes and those biology classes are pretty boring. So, to get a kid to be excited to be a scientist, you have to, figure out how to give them role models and leverage media as a way of getting people excited about this. I grew up in the generation of Bill Nye the Science Guy. And so, in today's age, I think creating more influence in how you can get people to be excited about science is really fundamentally important to get people to want to be the next great scientists.
That's fantastic. And Is the documentary or the film available on streaming as well?
Right now, just in IMAX theaters, but in the next
Okay.
year, we'll work with a streaming partner so that it becomes on a streaming service.
Terrific. Well, it reminds me that here at the Institute for a long time, we've actually haven't done it recently, but we used to actually screen documentaries on science or scientific topics because you're completely right. The storytelling that comes out with this kind of the power of media, so to speak, is really inspiring. Not just I think to the students, but to everyone that is working in the sciences. Often you tend to be pigeonholed in your own sort of little ivory tower and lose track about this sort of global effort that is all around us. So that's fantastic. Well, I wish you success with that. Um, the uh, you know, multiple people, I think your dad is included in that, have said that innovation and opportunity stemming from the biological and life sciences are really accelerating. And at a time when we think we've discovered everything there is to discover, really are the bio and life sciences that are giving us perhaps the biggest chance at true scientific revolutions. And it's not just genomics and some of the other omics, not that those are small things, but it's often the convergent nature of some of these sciences where you're looking at interdisciplinary sort of convergence and essentially making up complete new branches of science. Um, as you're thinking about, you already shared one insight in terms of what you find exciting, which is the convergence between data science and technology and biology. Are there other sectors sort of below the horizon that you are kind of particularly excited about that may be forthcoming in the future?
Yeah, I mean, on the more digital health side, we're pretty interested in AI and how it can play with a lot of data to optimize different processes. So we've looked at some stuff in medical billing and being able to see inefficiencies in those bills that are sent over, and seeing how you can use technology to streamline that or to detect some of the issues in some of those bills and then potentially save costs for patients. We've seen some interesting things around risk stratification for drug selection, using big amounts of data for being able to do better clinical trial recruitment. We invested in one company that's doing AI for drug delivery and being able to figure out, are there potentially different candidates that are more able to be interesting in terms of being able to deliver the drug or the payload in a more effective way. So I think there's a lot of really interesting technologies right now and companies out there. And I think it's an exciting time in biotech.
And do you do you see these sort of breakthrough type of innovations as accelerating at the moment, or do you actually think we're sort of plateauing with the new ideas in the sector?
I think we're definitely accelerating. I mean, I think certain things ebb and flow in terms of what's in vogue or exciting to investors, and that can change over time. But I think that there's a lot more people that are creating companies that are interesting. I think there's a lot more resources to do so now. And I think the proliferation of the advancement of, things like software, allow for there to be exciting capabilities to potentially find drugs or develop drugs faster. So I think right now we're at the precipice of exciting things in that regard. I think the biggest thing is seeing when does that happen? I don't think it's an issue about like, will it ever happen? I think it's more a question of when. People talk a lot about AI drug discovery. Will that be a big deal? And I do think it will be, but I think the question is more about when will that be, right? There's a lot of money that's been poured into these companies, but there hasn't been, at least great successes to date. And so I think in the next 5, 10 years, we'll start to get to hopefully see answers of if that's right. And I personally think it will be. And so I think picking the right ones is especially important right now as we have that rise in companies, doing things around that space.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point, which is, it was put in focus to me. I was recently at a VC conference, healthcare conference, and there was a sign outside that said, if you're not pitching a regenerative AI application, please leave. So there is, in some circles, a frustration that there is a bit of irrational exuberance around the potential role of AI, at least AI as it's defined today, um, uh, in terms of tackling problems that its statistical correlation power may be limiting or limited to. Do you think we need to see some fundamental improvements in the state of the art within AI in order to really materialize the vision of drug discovery, or other type of significant breakthrough? Or do you think the tools on the tech side are in place and we just need to find better ways to apply them?
I think everything can always be better. So I think all algorithms, all technologies that we have inevitably could be better. But I think the bigger issue and the important thing with AI is the data training set. So I think the bigger question is can we find the right data sets to train the AI so it can do what it needs to? And can you do that in a proprietary way so that a company can have a competitive edge? I think that there's definitely a lot of exciting things in AI, but I think oftentimes in any sort of thematic area, when people get really excited about it, then people start to, go a bit overboard sometimes. So there's corrections. But I do think the AI is a big and important piece to the biotech industry. I think it's just a question of the data to train these algorithms so that they can do things in a way that can make, really big changes to the biotechnology industry.
And that's a very interesting point. As we think sort of the big aggregators of data in healthcare or life sciences, um, there've been some interesting experiments at the government level. I'm thinking of the work going on in the UK right now, where the data that could become training data sets are increasingly being viewed as a national strategic resource, the same way as they would view research laboratories and other infrastructure that the government is actually investing in, and then figuring out ways of safely making that available to those that are building applications on that. Do you think do you think we need the help of government to aggregate the data sets that will help develop these algorithms? Or do you think you know, private players, especially in the context of private healthcare, um, will ultimately find a way to share the data in the appropriate manner?
I think oftentimes the government is inefficient. Um, and so because of that, you generally have a lot of bureaucracy. And because you have a lot of bureaucracy, it can make things more complicated or take longer. So I think the government definitely plays an important role in biotech. I think if they had more influence on things like data specifically, I think it could potentially create problems. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be programs to, maybe incentivize or to try to promote such things. But I think it was specifically a government type of initiative, like in the broadest sense. I think that potentially could slow down innovation, or complicate innovation, or de-incentivize innovation, right? If there's too much government intervention in things, part of the reason as to why I think people do really well in biotech or excited about biotech is people want to do good by the world and help patients, but they also are excited about the potential of building the next great company or technology. And so you have to keep that balance. And I think that's why startups are the way they are and it works the way it does because of those built-in incentives. So I think there's a balance there, and I do think government plays and can play an important role, but there's definitely a balancing act.
And in a similar fashion, going back to this question of the nonprofit sector and the for-profit sector, um, the this question of what's motivating people to really drive this innovation has come up. The nonprofits often speak in terms of impact as being the motivating factor. Obviously, startups and regular entrepreneurs are focused on um, first and foremost shareholder value and shareholder returns. Yet at the same time, we're seeing a bit of an evolution in terms of, what's corporate success. There's the famous 100 Fortune 500 companies that have signed a letter where they are committing to having notions of impact other than shareholder return being part of their ultimate business plans. So I'm just wondering, in your mind, especially as you look and evaluate startups, how important is impact, and how do you think about impact in the context of making money?
I mean, I think that, yeah, I think I probably learned this from my father. I think if you follow impact, at least in most cases, you will often find places where there are also great rewards. If you're influencing millions of people, which, inevitably would mean that they're making a lot of impact, usually financial success will follow. Obviously, that's not the case for everything, but I do think that generally there is a strong correlation. I think you have to balance those things, and it's complicated as you have more and more factors that you're meant to be weighing in society now than maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago or beyond. But I think you can balance those things. It just becomes another consideration. So there's more thoughtfulness that needs to go into it as you think about those things. But I think the very nature of being in biotech, investing, or creating startups is that you have people that want to do good, which is why they're in that industry. Biotech's not exactly easy. It's not easy to make money. So I think, there's probably a lot of other industries that are a lot easier that you may not be making as much impact in the same kind of way that I think you do in biotech. So I think generally, at least the majority of people in biotech probably have that at the center as, there are plenty of easier ways of making money than, creating the next drug.
Yeah. And does that translate in some of your investment consideration? In other words, will you be looking at the potential impact of a piece of technology or innovation in addition to financial metrics and other metrics as you make investment decisions?
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
So if I understood what you said, um, you're sort of viewing uh, impact as actually somewhat of an operating strategy. The sort of high impact endeavors, almost by definition, tend to mean that they'll scale and they'll potentially follow financial rewards. Um, so that seems like something you want to try to measure or at least follow or look at as you are sort of selecting the companies you may invest. I'm just asking the question whether that is indeed true.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something you think about and you consider. I mean, I think you have to believe that it's, a good viable business and that there's great ability to scale and the commercial opportunity makes sense. Certainly areas within biotech that are probably more difficult to find success in, and you have to weigh that. And those are all determinants and factors that are weighed as you make decisions. So I think the answer is it's a factor. But it has to be weighed against all those other factors as to whether or not it's the right decision to make.
Mhm. Um, Switching subject a little bit on you and on a more personal tone. Um, uh, you grew up with a dad that is a legend in our sector. Um, and I'm just wondering if there is any sort of how has that shaped you, and are there words of wisdom that your dad imparted on you that are now part of who you are, and that maybe you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean it's obviously played a big role in who I am and how I got there as to who I am personally and professionally. I think, you know, I feel very, my father is a very thoughtful, kind person, and that's very front and center about how he approaches anything. And so I think a lot of his values probably have impacted how I think about things and how I make decisions. Um, when I was younger, I think it's probably harder when you're younger because you don't really know who you are and you're like figuring out all those things. So like in high school or college or things like that, it's sort of like, what does all this mean? Um, my father also has changed over time in terms of like who he is within biotech, right? There are definitely different waves of that over time. Um, but I think, overall, as I've gotten older, at least, I'm 35 now. So like in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, as you start to be more cognizant and confident in who you are, then those things, as long as you're hopefully figuring out who you are, aren't as big of a deal in terms of at least negative impact. But I think when you're earlier in your life, it can be harder. Um, but overall now, I feel very fortunate. I've been able to meet amazing people and get to see an industry that's, quite incredible. And, I decided I didn't want to be a scientist. I think, being a scientist would not be very fun given who my dad is and the kind of reputation he has as a scientist. Um, so I think, that was the right decision. But I think being adjacent, but in the same industry, but being more on the business and VC side, I think that that's worked like for me and my sister who are both, doing things like that. So I think that delineation has been important. I think, if I decided I wanted to be the next drug delivery scientist, you know, you see it in sports, generally when, like if Michael Jordan's son decided to, play basketball, that would, not probably be very fun for him. So I think that that's, something I've certainly had to think about in my career as I think about my identity of how I want to spend my time and what I can be good at.
Yeah, having such a leader in the field as your dad undoubtedly has the ups and the downs, right? But it's been actually nice to see how you've sort of growing up with your own identity now and your own ultimately impact, Mark.
Yeah.
Um, so you, this is not quite on the personal side, but as you know, the Terasaki Institute is representing in Southern California a new kind of institute that has a highly translational focus, and really there are not a lot of peers on the West Coast for the kind of work we do. And I'm curious, as somebody who has a knowledge of this of the California or the West Coast sort of community, and certainly the Southern California community in life sciences, but comes from a firm grounding in the Boston community. Um, I'm curious if you had sort of some ideas, of contrast and compare. I mean, there's no question that the kind of ecosystem that exists in Boston is a very distant um, environment from what exists here on the West Coast. Um, but I'm just curious, as you look at the two sides, uh, do you see what do you think of the West Coast community as it's sort of growing up in for life sciences? Where do you see the key challenges for that sort of ecosystem development out this way? And maybe where do you see parallels or areas of strength?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Boston has cemented itself as sort of like the epicenter for biotech, but I think California with San Diego, San Francisco, and LA has, created quite a good ecosystem as well. But I think that's why a place like the Teriyaki Institute can play a great role, because that allows for there to be an institution that can really be a purveyor of innovation. The reason why Boston has been able to become what it is, beyond obviously Harvard and MIT, are some of those surrounding institutes like the Whitehead or the Koch or the Broad. These institutes are able to further and strengthen those innovation communities and create more efficiencies. Because all it comes down to really at the end of the day is efficiencies. How do you make more of a machine for churning out the IP that is in these labs so that companies can be created and then impact can be had on patients? If you think about the history of biotech in like the 70s or 80s, most of it was just doing research and getting grants, maybe doing some licenses to pharmaceutical companies. And in the 80s and 90s, you started to see that shift, which is when some of these big, first gen biotech companies were created. The Genentechs, the Genzymes, the Biogens, companies like that. And now, obviously, in the last 20 years, the biotech sector and the startup sector around that has become an enormous industry. And I think that plays in large part to these different agencies that are helping catalyze that growth, whether that's institutes like what you guys are doing, or other players in that regard. Yeah, obviously VC being one of them.
Yeah. Um, the it is an ecosystem, which means it's a chicken on the egg to know whether the capital um, comes first and then the startup community comes second, or whether the startup community that successfully exits creates the capital. Um, Operating here, especially in Southern California, we find that the VC community out here is pretty much at its infancies. And ironically, we're visiting Boston or the Bay Area a lot more than our local VCs in terms of supporting some of the entrepreneurship that is coming out here. How geographically dependent is sort of your investment horizon? Would you consider an investment from Boston in Southern California, or would that present an extra challenge? And is there a role for sort of regional VCs that would maybe take the time to do the due diligence as a lead? Um,
I
what's
don't
your
think it.
experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we mostly are looking at US stuff. I don't think it particularly matters all that much if you invest in a company in Texas versus San Fran or Boston. I mean, there's some perks to being able to do that. I think overall, though, like, I don't know that it makes a huge difference, unless it's, very far away or another landscape that you have to weigh. If it was a European company or a company in Asia, then you're weighing a lot of other factors. You're looking at things like regulatory, commercial. But if it's US company, it's a US company, other than the vicinity to which you want to be able to meet with that founder in person. But I think for a long time, and certainly the pandemic showed us this, a lot of business can get done virtually. It doesn't all have to be in person. And so I don't think that that's a massive constraint. We've invested in a company in Texas, done a couple in Boston. I'm sure we'll do a bunch in California. I think you also asked regional VCs. I do think regional VCs, at least at a small scale, can be interesting if they're in communities that don't have as much innovation. I don't know that having a regional VC in California or Boston or Texas makes sense, but some of these smaller markets, emerging markets, St. Louis or, Tennessee or something like that. Yeah, I think you could have micro VC funds that have strategies there, but it's a hard business to pick great ones if you're really constrained to just one geography, a small geography, and you need to make certain returns. I think that's very difficult. Now, if it's more like government based and the incentives are different, then that changes things. But I think if you're like a Denver biotech VC fund, I think that would be at least more difficult. I would never want to say never, but I think it's certainly more difficult than if you're just looking for the best companies in the US. That would be my thoughts there.
Yeah, makes sense. So we have a number of young scientists, and um, we fancy ourselves as not only driving sort of their scientific accomplishments, but also driving a sort of academic entrepreneurship, where most of our scientists are not happy with just quote the publication. They want to actually see the innovation get translated and ultimately translate into something that achieves an impact, and that often means creating companies. So many of our scientists are also entrepreneurs, and you know, they are relatively new to the entrepreneurship cycle and the funding cycles and everything else. So in sort of 2024, what advice would you give such a young entrepreneur about raising capital and how to drive their innovation further? Again, sort of looking at the reality of today's capital markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot more people that are interested in that now. I think there's also a lot more resources to be able to do that. I think there's a lot of smaller VC funds. I think you have more resources, which is why you're seeing younger founders. So I think there's a lot of opportunities now for younger, less experienced founders to make a dent in biotech. I think it's inevitable that you'll see a great success come from one of those types of founders. Obviously, historically, it's probably been more, from like a very large VC fund, like a flagship or a Third Rock, or from people who've come from industry. But I think now there's more opportunity for that not to just be the only one size fits all type of way of doing it. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting things that we'll see over the next 5 to 10 years. And you might see some different VC models. We're certainly seeing some. You'll see, I think, different, probably nonprofits that are looking to cater to those kinds of founders. And so I think now versus 10 years ago, it's probably much better and easier to be a younger founder in the space, and potentially be able to make great impact.
Well, those are encouraging words to everybody. So I thank you for that. Anything you want to add that we didn't cover today? That is a message you want to offer our audience?
I mean, I think, I guess the only thing I leave people with is, there's incredible opportunities right now happening in biotech, and there's a lot of people trying to do a lot of things. I think talking to a lot of people and building a great network and learning through doing that is something that is worth your time, and that you'll get a lot of no's in your life, and you got to just keep going. And inevitably, I think ultimately things, I think, end up happening if you keep pushing and pushing and pushing and working towards it. And so I think that's the exciting thing about startups is you are in this high, fast growing area that you can make things happen, and technically anything is possible. So I think it's a really exciting place to be, and it's an exciting place because you're also helping people. These kinds of companies can make a big impact on the world and save lives and make people have and live better lives too. And so I think that's a very admirable use of one's time.
Thank you for that message. So what I'd like to do is open, in the remaining minutes, open up questions from the audience. And for the audience that is online, you can use the Q&A feature to type your questions, and we'll be picking them up here and responding to them live. The first question is, how do you think about AI's role in cancer drug design, and in sort of predicting drug response?
I mean, I think it's an area where there's a lot of great potential, and I don't know that that's disease specific. I think across all diseases, there's a lot of interesting areas where AI drug design can have great impact. I think again, it's a data piece. So I think having the right data sets to be able to do that well is super important. But that's obviously an area where there's one of the biggest, I guess, subgroups or subcategories for needing drug development. So I think it's an area where if people have a great platform to build around that is very interesting. And there's a lot of investors that are interested in that space. So I think it's very important.
And I'll add a corollary while we see if there's any other questions from the audience. But the to what extent do you see these technologies as sort of transforming precision medicine, where you're actually looking at AI predictive models to individualize treatments for which, say, the response from the disease or the cancer is enhanced, and how do you think of it in terms of an investment? About supporting companies that are going after the sort of clinical application of this use, where you're not discovering a new drug, but you are optimizing the treatment.
I think that that's important. I think optimizing treatments and using data to do that and AI to supplement that to be able to make treatments more efficient or effective is very important. I think it's still early days though for these platforms. We're seeing readouts of data around this for a few companies, but there hasn't been any great successes yet. So I think it's something like in any subcategory of drugs that you're going to need to see a great success before more and more capital is poured into it. But I think currently, as it stands, people are very interested in it. So they're going to certainly pay attention.
Excellent. So the next question relates to fundraising around proof of concept type of data. So, how much proof of concept do you need in order to be able to unlock early stage funding? I think is the question. And how do you think about proof of concept of the type that comes out of an academic lab versus, hardcore clinical validation?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's going to have different risk tolerances as a fund. Some of that will depend if it's pre-seed or seed or A or beyond. I think if it's truly just out of the lab and it doesn't have like tox data or things like that, then it's obviously more high risk. That's certainly one bar. I think that is the nature of why you have pre-seed funds. They'll take way more risk, but they also will want pretty good ownership and low valuations. So sort of a balancing act of how do you look at valuations and how do you reward risk? The other piece is like, building companies. So some funds like ours, like we're probably more interested in building a company with a founder because we'll have a lot more ownership than if we did pre-seed, because the risk reward is kind of the same, except if we did pre-seed, we'd own, maybe 30% less of the company. And so when you own less and less of a company, it makes the upside more difficult in terms of balancing the risk and reward. And so that's something that all VC funds have to think about as they make a decision around making an investment.
Yeah. Another question is, what are future areas that we should focus on beyond AI, or that you're focusing on beyond AI?
Yeah, I mean, we're very excited about, on the digital health side, risk stratification of picking drugs, which I guess some of that leverages AI. but is more of a data point, a data problem that we're solving for. We've seen a few companies that are pretty interesting around that. I think workflow in biopharma for making more efficient processes is an area that's very interesting, especially around things like sales or manufacturing, things that can take a lot of time that you potentially could make faster. But again, you may, I think, probably, the issue is that most solutions probably, especially in the world that we're in, where there's inefficiencies, theoretically AI will make it better. It doesn't mean it's the only thing you should be focusing on, but I think that AI is probably more and more going to touch upon the majority of innovation in some capacity. There's also a lot of companies that just tack on AI because it's exciting and sexier, and so that gets tacked on to what they're trying to do. So there's a balancing act of how to look at companies and how to think about AI as to whether or not that is something interesting or not. So I think there's definitely opportunities that are not AI, at least as the major part of it, but AI is touching a lot of the areas that we probably are interested in.
Mm-hmm. And the last question is, from an entrepreneur's perspective, what would you say would be the reasons for going after nonprofit money versus, VC for-profit type of money? Is there an inherent
Control.
advantage of one versus the other?
Yeah, I mean, control. I mean, if you're able to get nonprofit money, it's non-dilutive. So that's great, but it's hard, right? I mean, writing grants it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, and if it fails, it fails. And so I think it's a balancing act of both of those. I think nonprofit capital, if you can get it, is probably better than a lot of VC money, but it's also probably a lot harder to get for obvious reasons. There's a lot of hoops that you have to run through to get nonprofit money. I think VC money also comes with help. So if you're an early founder that hasn't done a lot in the space, then it's also important because they can teach you a lot of things that you might not be aware of. And so that makes that very interesting too. So I think there's pros and cons to both, but I think VC money is probably a better route, but it's important probably to look at both. But I think funding a full company via only nonprofit money is a much more difficult task than raising VC money. VC money is still hard, but you're not writing, some 20-30 page grant. And you probably have to write like 10 of those, so maybe you get one of those. And I don't have as much experience in grant writing, but I think they also still have like certain requirements and reporting and all sorts of things that are also a bit of a pain too. Obviously that would be dependent on each grant, but that's also a consideration that people might want to consider.
Yeah. We just got one more question, and I think we'll call it after that. So in helping new entrepreneurs start a company, one of the biggest challenges appears to be finding the right fit for the right VC, whether it's a question of stage or whether it's a question of sector or whether it's just appetite for the risk, like you mentioned earlier. What would be your advice on how to go about, from an entrepreneur's perspective, really engaging with the right VCs as opposed to any VC?
It's a hard one. I mean, I think, some of it's like a dating process. You're meeting a lot of people, you're, learning a lot of things, and you're making a lot of, connections to a lot of people and very fast. I think it becomes apparent where there feels like there's a good fit as you talk to those partners. Some people are going to really hang around the hoop and be interested in what you're doing. Other people will take a first meeting and you'll never hear from them again. I think, hearing how they think about things philosophically and their reputation as you talk to other entrepreneurs, I mean, those are some of the best ways that you can see if it's a good fit and see if it makes sense for you. But I think it's important to talk to a lot of VCs because even if you're not going to get their capital, you might in later rounds, and you're going to learn a lot about what's good about your business and also what's not as good about your business. I think the more that you get holes poked in what you're doing, the more prepared you're going to be as you go out there, and you'll be better for it.
Yeah. So we did get one more question. I guess we have a couple more minutes before the top of the hour. So I'll read you this one. It's somewhat related to the question you just answered. So I'm going to take some editorial liberty and change it slightly. It's a question of an entrepreneur who has uh, proof of concept data and is really looking for sort of pre-seed investors. Is there a category of investors that would be more keen on that type of risk profile? Uh, and is there sort of a rule of thumb on who they should go after to orchestrate a pre-seed round?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all sorts of different funders. At the earliest stages, you want to find angel investors, angel groups, pre-seed funds. Those are the best places to go. I think beyond that, sometimes you might be able to, grants are still a good place to go. So I think doing all those things, especially at the earliest stage, are important because that's the hardest point of raising capital because you haven't done anything yet. So it's really more of a personal game. The proof of concept data is important, but actually the person is going to matter more. Why should I believe in this person? Why do I think this person is the champion to make this company work? Why do I believe in this person? At pre-seed and seed, it's a lot more human than it is science. Over time, it becomes much more science than human. The human still matters, but the human matters especially more in pre-seed, seed, and A companies because so much is about the culture, the person, and what they're trying to build or invest in.
That's a very good point, and I'm always amazed when relatively inexperienced entrepreneurs put together decks describing the science in great detail, but forgetting to talk about the people factor. And I was always told VCs invest in the people first. I guess I'll ask you one more question. What has been the biggest challenge for you in building a new VC fund?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you build anything, there are bumps in the road of different capacities. Some of them are macro, like right now is just a very tough time for fundraising. But so things might take longer. Picking the right people, that's always something that, you have to think about. I think the hardest thing for me, I don't know, I'd say that anything has been particularly hard, but I think just managing all the different processes across the board, those are things you have to, you're essentially retraining your brain and your essence of being because you're changing how you do things. I spent, 10 years on the operating side and doing some family investing. So now you're sort of swapping how you're thinking about things. You have to be thinking about many, many, many companies versus one. And so the sort of transference and change as your operating system to do that well is something that you have to constantly be able to adapt to. And I think that that's probably been the thing, that I try to be the most thoughtful about so that you can be in the right mindset to be able to do this well. So I think that that's really important. If you want to be a good investor, you have to get into the mindset of, what is a great investor and what are those things that I need to be doing? Is that reading literature all the time? Is that meeting entrepreneurs all the time? How do I spend my time so I maximize the effect of what I can do to be great at what I'm doing.
Excellent. Well, I really want to thank you for all your time and insight and your support of the Terasaki Institute and your other sort of passion projects. And we wish you good luck with RX Capital, and we look forward to seeing RX emerge from stealth and look at the great unicorns that you're going to be building with that.
Well, thank you. It's been really a pleasure, and I appreciate people tuning in.
Thank you, everyone. And this is being recorded, and it will be available in our Terasaki Talk channels for replay if you missed it or if you missed part of it.